I thought I was having a heart attack all over again when my 7-year-old grandson Jake grabbed Dr. Martinez's hand in the hospital corridor and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "My mom said you'll kill Grandma on purpose because she doesn't want her around anymore." The silence that followed was so deafening I could hear my own heartbeat echoing through the sterile hallway. But it wasn't my heart condition that was threatening to kill me in that moment. It was the devastating realization that my own daughter-in-law had manipulated an innocent child into believing that doctors were murderers, and that she had used my beloved grandson as a weapon to sabotage the surgery that could save my life. What I discovered over the next 48 hours about Rachel's true motives would shatter my family, expose a conspiracy that went far deeper than medical fear-mongering, and reveal that the woman I'd welcomed into my home was willing to let me die for reasons so sinister they would land her in prison and leave my grandson traumatized for years to come. My name is Dorothy Williams, I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same small town outside of Dallas, Texas my entire life, where I raised 4 children as a mostly single mother after my husband died of cancer when I was 45. I worked as a school secretary for 37 years, saved every penny I could, and managed to build a comfortable retirement for myself in a modest house on 3 acres with a vegetable garden and enough space for my grandchildren to run around when they visit. I've always been healthy and independent, the kind of woman who mows her own lawn, changes her own oil, and has never asked anyone for help with anything I could do myself. So when I started experiencing chest pains and shortness of breath 6 months ago, I initially tried to ignore them, assuming it was just the normal aches and pains of getting older. But when I collapsed in my kitchen one morning while making coffee, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson called an ambulance, and I found myself in the emergency room getting tests that revealed I had a serious heart condition that required immediate surgical intervention. The cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, explained that I had a blocked artery that was causing my heart to work too hard, and that without surgery, I would likely have a major heart attack within the next few months. "The good news, Mrs. Williams," Dr. Martinez had said with a reassuring smile, "is that this is a routine procedure that we perform dozens of times every month. With your overall health and fitness level, your prognosis for a full recovery is excellent." I was scared, of course, but also relieved to have an explanation for what had been happening to me and a clear path forward to fix it. I called my son Michael immediately to tell him about the diagnosis and the scheduled surgery, expecting him to be supportive and helpful, as he'd always been throughout my life. Michael is 34 years old, a good man who works as an electrician and has been married to Rachel for 8 years. They have 1 child together, my grandson Jake, who is 7 years old and the light of my life. Michael has always been attentive and caring toward me, calling every few days to check on me, helping with home repairs when needed, and bringing Jake over for visits at least once a week. Rachel, on the other hand, has always been more complicated for me to understand. She's 31 years old, works as a registered nurse at the local hospital, and on the surface appears to be a loving wife and mother. She's always been polite to me, never openly disrespectful or confrontational, but there's always been something about our relationship that felt forced and artificial, like she was performing the role of dutiful daughter-in-law rather than genuinely caring about me as a person. Over the years, I've tried to chalk up our awkward dynamic to natural differences in personality, or perhaps the normal adjustment period that comes with welcoming a new person into the family. But there have been small incidents and comments that have gradually made me question whether Rachel genuinely likes or respects me, or whether she merely tolerates me because she has to. For example, Rachel frequently makes comments about how difficult it must be for me to maintain my house and property at my age, suggesting that I should consider selling and moving into a senior living community. When I explain that I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself and have no interest in giving up my independence, she responds with concerned looks and comments about how stubborn elderly people can be about accepting help. She's also made several remarks over the years about older people being set in their ways and resistant to change, always with a tone that suggests this is a character flaw rather than just a natural part of aging. When Jake started school and began spending more time at our house after school and on weekends, Rachel would sometimes make comments about how I was spoiling him or not following the parenting rules she'd established, even though Michael had never expressed any concerns about my relationship with my grandson. Most troubling, Rachel has occasionally made remarks about the financial burden that caring for elderly family members can place on younger generations, talking about friends whose parents required expensive medical care or assistance with daily living. These comments always felt pointed, as if she was laying the groundwork for future conversations about my own care needs. Even though I've always been clear that I have savings, insurance, and plans in place to take care of myself. When I called to tell Michael about my heart condition and upcoming surgery, his reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. Immediate concern, offers to help with whatever I needed, and reassurance that he'd be there with me throughout the entire process. Rachel's reaction was noticeably different. "Oh my," she said when Michael put her on the phone. "Heart surgery at your age? That's quite serious, isn't it?" When I explained that Dr. Martinez had said the procedure was routine and had an excellent success rate, Rachel's response surprised me. "Well, Dorothy, you know that doctors always try to sound optimistic, but cardiac surgery in patients over 65 carries significantly higher risks than they sometimes tell you about. Have you gotten a second opinion?" I told her that Dr. Martinez had been highly recommended and that I felt confident in his abilities, but Rachel continued to express doubts. "I just think you should be aware of all the potential complications," she said. "Anesthesia can be very hard on older patients. Sometimes the recovery is much more difficult than anticipated. And honestly, sometimes the surgery itself creates more problems than it solves." These comments struck me as odd coming from a registered nurse, someone who should understand medical procedures and be supportive of evidence-based treatment. But I assumed Rachel was just being cautious and looking out for my well-being, even if her approach felt more pessimistic than helpful. Over the next few weeks, as I prepared for surgery, Rachel continued to make concerning comments whenever the topic came up. She would mention news stories about surgical complications, talk about patients she'd known who hadn't recovered well from similar procedures, and frequently emphasize the risks of surgery in older patients. "You know, Dorothy," she said during one family dinner, "sometimes the quality of life after major surgery just isn't the same. You might want to consider whether putting yourself through all of this is really worth it." Michael would usually shut down these conversations by changing the subject or reminding Rachel that the doctors had recommended surgery and that I had made my decision, but I noticed that her comments were starting to make him more nervous about the procedure than he had been initially. More concerning was the effect Rachel's doom and gloom attitude was having on Jake. My grandson had always been a happy, outgoing child who loved spending time with me, but in the weeks leading up to my surgery, he became increasingly anxious and withdrawn whenever the hospital or my medical situation came up in conversation. At first, I thought this was normal childhood anxiety about a beloved grandparent being sick. Jake had always been sensitive and empathetic, and it made sense that he would be worried about my health. But as the surgery date approached, his behavior became more concerning. Jake started asking strange questions like, "Grandma, what if the doctors make a mistake?" And, "What happens if you don't wake up from the sleeping medicine?" When I tried to reassure him that the doctors were very good at their jobs and that I would be fine, he would look at me with an expression of doubt and fear that seemed far too mature for a 7-year-old. One afternoon when Jake was staying with me after school while Michael and Rachel were both at work, he asked me a question that made my blood run cold. "Grandma, do some doctors hurt people on purpose?" I knelt down to his level and asked him what he meant by that question. Like, if they don't like someone, do they sometimes make them sicker instead of better? I assured Jake that doctors take an oath to help people and would never intentionally hurt a patient, but he didn't seem convinced. But what if they think someone is too old and should just die? The sophistication of this question shocked me. This wasn't the kind of concern that a 7-year-old would develop on his own. Someone had been putting these ideas in his head, and I had a sinking feeling that I knew who it was. When I asked Jake where he had heard about doctors hurting people, he got a guilty look on his face and said, "I'm not supposed to tell. It's a secret." I explained to Jake that secrets about safety were different from surprise party secrets, and that he should always tell a trusted adult if someone asked him to keep a secret that made him worried or scared. After some gentle encouragement, Jake finally opened up. "Mommy told me that some doctors are mean to old people because they think old people take up too much space in the hospital. She said that your doctor might not try his best to help you because he thinks you're too old to matter." I felt sick to my stomach. Rachel had been systematically filling my grandson's head with fear about medical professionals, and specifically about my upcoming surgery. But why would a registered nurse, someone who worked alongside doctors every day, want to terrify a child about medical care? As gently as possible, I asked Jake if his mother had told him anything else about doctors or about my surgery. She said that you might not come home from the hospital because the doctor might decide that you've lived long enough. But she said it's okay to tell the doctor that he's not allowed to hurt you. Because sometimes if you remind them that people are watching, they'll be more careful. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I realized that Rachel wasn't just expressing general medical concerns. She was coaching Jake to create a scene at the hospital that would either delay my surgery or cause the medical staff to question their treatment plan. But I still didn't understand why Rachel would want to sabotage my medical care. Was she genuinely convinced that the surgery was dangerous, or was there something else motivating her interference? I decided to have a conversation with my sister Susan, who had always been my closest confidant and had known Rachel since she married Michael. Susan lived about an hour away and hadn't spent as much time with Rachel as I had, but she had always been observant about people and relationships. "Susan," I said during our phone call that evening, "have you ever gotten the impression that Rachel doesn't like me very much?" Susan was quiet for a moment before responding. "Dorothy, I've wondered about that myself. She's never been openly rude to you, but I've noticed that she seems to get tense whenever you're around, and she doesn't seem to enjoy family gatherings when you're there. Have you ever heard her make comments about older people being burdens, or about the costs of caring for aging family members?" Actually, yes. At Michael's birthday party last year, she made several remarks about friends whose elderly parents were requiring expensive care, and how difficult that was for the adult children. It seemed like she was hinting at something, but I wasn't sure what. Susan and I talked for over an hour, comparing observations and trying to understand what might be motivating Rachel's behavior. By the end of the conversation, we had both arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Rachel saw me as an inconvenience at best, and possibly as an obstacle to something she wanted. The night before my surgery, Michael and Rachel brought Jake over to spend the evening with me, ostensibly so we could have quality time together before I went to the hospital. But throughout the visit, I noticed Rachel having whispered conversations with Jake in the other room, and when they returned to the living room, Jake looked upset and anxious. At bedtime, when Jake was saying goodnight to me, he hugged me extra tight and whispered in my ear, "Grandma, I'm going to protect you tomorrow, okay?" I asked him what he meant by that, and he said, "I'm going to make sure the doctor knows that he has to be nice to you." That night, I lay awake thinking about everything that had been happening and trying to decide what to do. Should I confront Rachel directly about what she had been telling Jake? Should I talk to Michael about my concerns? Should I postpone the surgery until I could figure out what was really going on? By morning, I had decided to proceed with the surgery as scheduled but to be alert for any attempts by Rachel to interfere with my medical care. I had no idea how public and humiliating her sabotage would be, or how much damage it would do to my relationship with the medical staff who were trying to save my life. We arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m. for my 8 o'clock surgery. Michael, Rachel, Jake, and Susan were all there to support me through the pre-surgical preparation. The atmosphere should have been nervous but hopeful, with family members offering encouragement and medical staff providing professional reassurance about the procedure. Instead, there was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite identify. Rachel seemed unusually alert and focused, like she was waiting for something to happen. Jake was clinging to me more than usual and kept looking back and forth between his mother and me with an expression of anxiety and confusion. Michael was trying to be supportive and positive, asking the nurses questions about the procedure and making jokes to lighten the mood, but I could tell he was picking up on the strange energy as well. Dr. Martinez arrived around 7:30 to do his final pre-surgical consultation, explaining once again what the procedure would involve, how long it would take, and what I could expect during recovery. He was professional, confident, and reassuring, exactly the kind of surgeon you would want performing a life-saving operation. As Dr. Martinez finished his explanation and prepared to leave so I could be taken to the operating room, Jake suddenly broke away from Rachel's side and ran over to grab the doctor's hand. What happened next will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. In a voice loud enough to be heard throughout the busy pre-surgical area, with other families and medical staff within earshot, my 7-year-old grandson looked up at Dr. Martinez and said, "My mom said you'll kill Grandma on purpose because she doesn't want her around anymore." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Dr. Martinez's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, and then concern. Michael's mouth fell open. Susan gasped audibly. Other families in the area turned to stare at our group, but it was Rachel's reaction that told me everything I needed to know about what had really been happening. Instead of looking surprised or horrified that her son had said such a terrible thing, Rachel looked panicked and guilty, like someone who had been caught in the middle of executing a plan that had just gone horribly wrong. "Jake," she said sharply, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from Dr. Martinez. "You weren't supposed to. I mean, that's not what we talked about." Dr. Martinez knelt down to Jake's level and spoke to him in a calm, gentle voice. "Jake, can you tell me exactly what your mother said about me and your grandmother's surgery?" Jake looked back at his mother with confusion, clearly realizing that he had said something wrong but not understanding what it was. "She said that some doctors don't like to help old people because they think old people should just die to make room for younger people. And she said that you might decide not to save Grandma because she's old and takes up space that younger people need." Dr. Martinez stood up slowly, his professional composure intact but his eyes showing a mixture of concern and anger. "Mrs. Williams," he said to Rachel, "I need to speak with you privately. Now." But before Rachel could respond, Michael stepped forward, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment. "What the hell is going on here, Rachel? Why would you tell our son something like that? Why would you make him afraid of the doctors who are trying to help my mother?" Rachel tried to deflect and minimize what had happened. "Michael, you're overreacting. I was just trying to prepare Jake for the possibility that the surgery might not go well. I wanted him to understand that complications can happen with older patients. By telling him that I might kill his grandmother on purpose?" Dr. Martinez interjected. "Mrs. Williams, I've been a cardiac surgeon for 15 years. I've performed over 3,000 successful heart surgeries. Your mother-in-law's procedure is routine, and her prognosis is excellent. There was absolutely no medical reason to frighten this child or to suggest that her treatment would be anything other than the best possible care." The confrontation was drawing attention from other medical staff, and I realized that my surgery was likely going to be delayed while this situation was sorted out. But more importantly, I was beginning to understand that Rachel's interference had been deliberate and calculated, not just the result of excessive worry or medical ignorance. Susan, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, stepped forward and addressed Rachel directly. "Rachel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you want Dorothy to have this surgery?" Rachel's face went white. "Of course I want her to have the surgery if it's medically necessary. I just think she should be fully informed about the risks." "That's not what I asked," Susan pressed. "I asked if you want her to have the surgery, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been trying to sabotage her medical care by terrorizing a 7-year-old child." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and I watched Rachel's face cycle through several emotions before settling on defensive anger. "How dare you accuse me of trying to hurt Dorothy? I'm a registered nurse. I understand medical procedures better than anyone here except the doctor. I was just trying to make sure Dorothy understood what she was getting herself into. By telling your son that the doctor might commit murder?" Michael's voice was getting louder, and I could see other people in the hospital corridor stopping to watch our family drama unfold. Dr. Martinez, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, made a decision that surprised all of us. "I'm postponing Mrs. Williams' surgery until we can schedule a family meeting to address these concerns properly. This level of conflict and mistrust is not conducive to a successful surgical outcome, and I won't operate on a patient when family members are actively undermining the medical team." My heart sank. I knew that delaying the surgery was risky, and I was terrified that Rachel's manipulation had succeeded in derailing my treatment. "Dr. Martinez," I said, "please don't let this family drama affect my medical care. I trust you completely, and I want to proceed with the surgery as scheduled. Mrs. Williams, I appreciate your confidence in me, but I've learned over the years that family dynamics can significantly impact surgical outcomes. When there's this level of discord and mistrust, it creates stress and anxiety that can complicate both the procedure and the recovery process." He looked around at our group, Michael red-faced with anger, Rachel pale and defensive, Jake crying and confused, Susan protective and suspicious, and me caught in the middle of it all. "I'm going to refer you to our patient advocate who can help mediate this situation and ensure that everyone's concerns are addressed before we proceed with surgery." As Dr. Martinez walked away, I felt a fury unlike anything I'd experienced in my 68 years of life. Rachel's manipulation had not only terrorized my grandson and humiliated me in front of the medical staff, but it had also potentially jeopardized my access to life-saving medical care. "Rachel," I said, my voice shaking with anger, "I want to know exactly what you told Jake about my surgery, and I want to know why you've been trying to sabotage my medical treatment." Rachel looked around at the faces staring at her husband, her son, her sister-in-law, and her mother-in-law, and I could see her calculating whether to continue lying or to finally tell the truth. "I wasn't trying to sabotage anything," she said weakly. "I was just worried about the risks of surgery in someone your age." "Bullshit," Susan said bluntly. "You're a registered nurse, Rachel. You know exactly what the success rates are for this type of surgery in healthy patients. You know that Dorothy is in excellent health for her age. You know that Dr. Martinez is a respected surgeon with an excellent track record. So why don't you tell us what's really going on here?" Jake was still crying, clearly traumatized by the adult conflict swirling around him and confused about why everyone was angry at his mother. Michael picked up his son and held him close, trying to comfort him while also processing his own shock and anger at his wife's behavior. "Rachel, I need you to explain this to me right now. Why would you tell our son that the doctor might hurt my mother? What possible reason could you have for doing something so cruel and destructive?" Rachel looked trapped, and for a moment I thought she might confess whatever was really motivating her behavior. Instead, she doubled down on her lies. "Fine, you all want to act like I'm the villain here, go ahead. But when this surgery goes wrong, when Dorothy has complications or doesn't recover the way you're all expecting, don't come crying to me. I tried to warn everyone about the risks, but nobody wants to listen to the medical professional in the family." With that, Rachel grabbed her purse and stormed out of the hospital, leaving Michael holding Jake and the rest of us staring after her in shock. The patient advocate, Mrs. Henderson, arrived about 30 minutes later and spent the next 2 hours talking with our family about what had happened and how to move forward. She was professional and compassionate, helping us process the emotional trauma of the morning, while also working with Dr. Martinez to reschedule my surgery. During our conversation with Mrs. Henderson, more details emerged about what Rachel had been telling Jake in the weeks leading up to my surgery. It wasn't just general fear-mongering about medical risks. Rachel had specifically told Jake that I was taking up too much space in the family, that caring for me was expensive and difficult, and that it might be better for everyone if I didn't survive the surgery. She had also coached Jake on what to say to the medical staff, telling him that he needed to protect Grandma by making sure the doctors knew that people were watching and that they needed to try their best to help me. Most disturbingly, Rachel had told Jake that if I died during surgery, it would be God's will, and that he shouldn't be sad because I was old and ready to go to heaven. Hearing these details from my traumatized 7-year-old grandson was heartbreaking, but it also helped me understand the scope of Rachel's manipulation and the depth of her desire to see me gone from the family. Mrs. Henderson arranged for Jake to speak with a child psychologist to help him process the conflicting messages he had received about my medical care, and to reassure him that doctors are helpers, not people who hurt patients on purpose. She also scheduled a family meeting for the following week to address the underlying conflicts that had led to this crisis before rescheduling my surgery. But I wasn't willing to wait a week to get answers about Rachel's motivation. I was scared, angry, and determined to understand why my daughter-in-law wanted me dead. That evening, Susan and I sat down with Michael and had the most difficult conversation of our family's history. "Hey, I need to know something important before we continue this intense story. Drop family in the comments if you think Rachel has hidden motives beyond just medical fears. And make sure you subscribe because what we discovered about Rachel's real plan will shock you to your core and explain why she was willing to destroy a child's trust to get what she wanted." "Michael," I said as gently as I could, "I need to ask you some questions about your marriage that might be painful, but I think Rachel's behavior today goes far beyond medical anxiety. I think there's something else going on here." Michael looked exhausted and defeated, still processing the fact that his wife had manipulated their son and sabotaged his mother's medical care. "Mom, I honestly don't know what to think anymore. The woman who did that to Jake today doesn't seem like the person I married. I mean, Rachel can be critical and controlling sometimes, but I never thought she was capable of something this cruel and manipulative." Susan and I exchanged a look, and I decided to share some of the concerns I've been developing about Rachel over the past few years. Michael, has Rachel ever talked to you about wanting me to move into assisted living or sell my house? Michael nodded slowly. She's mentioned it a few times. She says she worries about you living alone on that property, and she thinks it might be safer for you to be in a community with other seniors and medical staff nearby. Has she ever talked about the financial aspects of my living situation? Michael looked uncomfortable. What do you mean? I mean, has she ever expressed concerns about the cost of maintaining my house, or talked about what would happen to my property and savings if I became unable to care for myself? Michael was quiet for a long time before answering. She has mentioned that your house is probably worth a lot of money now, and that it might make sense to sell it while the market is good rather than waiting until there's some kind of crisis. Susan leaned forward. Michael, do you and Rachel have any financial problems that you haven't mentioned to Dorothy? Not exactly problems, but things are tight. Rachel wants to buy a bigger house in a better school district for Jake, and she's been talking about maybe having another baby. The kind of house she wants costs about twice what we could get for our current place, so we'd need a significant down payment to make it work. I felt a chill run through me as the pieces started falling into place. Rachel wasn't just trying to get me out of the way because she found me inconvenient. She was trying to get access to my assets. Michael, what do you know about my financial situation? About my will and my plans for my property? Michael looked embarrassed. Mom, I've never wanted to think about stuff like that. I know you've always been responsible with money, and I assume you have things figured out for your retirement. I do have things figured out. I own my house outright. I have about $200,000 in savings and investments, and I have a life insurance policy that will cover my final expenses. According to my current will, everything goes to you when I die, with the understanding that you'll use some of it to establish a college fund for Jake. I watched Michael process this information, and I could see him beginning to understand the implications. So if something happened to you, Rachel and I would inherit your house and your savings. That's right. And if I were to die in the next few years while Jake is still young, you and Rachel would have immediate access to those assets to use for things like buying a bigger house or having more children. Susan picked up where I left off. But if Dorothy lives for another 10 or 15 years, which is entirely possible given her good health, then the money might be spent on her own care needs, or the house might need to be sold to pay for assisted living or medical expenses. Michael was staring at us with growing horror as he understood what we were suggesting. You think Rachel was trying to? You think she wanted you to die? I think Rachel realized that my survival was an obstacle to her financial plans, and she decided to remove that obstacle by preventing me from getting the medical care I need. But she's a nurse. She would know that without the surgery, you'd likely have a heart attack within months. Exactly, Susan said. She would know that delaying or preventing the surgery would essentially be a death sentence, but it would look like natural causes. No one would suspect that your wife had murdered your mother by sabotaging her medical care. Michael stood up and started pacing around my living room, his hands running through his hair as he tried to process what we were telling him. This is insane. You're talking about my wife, the mother of my child. You're saying she's capable of murder for money. I'm saying that her behavior today makes no sense unless she had a motive beyond medical caution, I replied. And the only motive that explains coaching a 7-year-old to disrupt his grandmother's surgery is a desire to prevent that surgery from happening. Michael sat back down and put his head in his hands. If what you're saying is true, then I've been married to a sociopath for 8 years. I've been sharing a bed with someone who was planning to kill my mother for inheritance money. The three of us sat in silence for several minutes, each of us trying to process the magnitude of what we were discussing. Finally, Susan spoke up. Michael, we need to figure out how to prove this. If Rachel really is willing to commit murder for financial gain, then Dorothy isn't safe, and neither is Jake. What do you mean Jake isn't safe? I mean that if Rachel is capable of manipulating him to help her commit murder now, what might she be willing to do to him in the future? And what happens if Jake ever becomes an obstacle to something Rachel wants? That possibility seemed to galvanize Michael in a way that even the threat to my life hadn't. The idea that his wife might pose a danger to their son brought out a protective fury that I'd never seen in my mild-mannered son. What do we need to do to prove this? Susan and I have been thinking about this question all day, and we had some ideas. First, we need to document everything that happened today. We need to get a statement from Jake about what Rachel told him. While the details are still fresh in his memory, we need to contact the hospital and get a report about the incident from Dr. Martinez and the patient advocate. Second, we need to look at Rachel's recent behavior and communications to see if we can find evidence of her planning or her motivations. Phone records, internet searches, financial documents, anything that might show she was researching my medical condition or my financial situation. Third, we need to protect Dorothy by making sure she gets the surgery she needs, but in a way that Rachel can't interfere with. Michael agreed to help us gather evidence, but he also insisted that we involve law enforcement if we found proof that Rachel had been planning to harm me. Over the next week, while my surgery was postponed, we conducted our own investigation into Rachel's behavior and discovered evidence that was even more damning than we had expected. Jake, working with the child psychologist, was able to provide detailed information about the conversations he'd had with his mother. It turned out that Rachel had been preparing him for months, not just weeks, gradually introducing ideas about doctors who hurt old people and grandmothers who might be better off in heaven. She had also shown Jake articles on the internet about medical malpractice and surgical complications, selectively choosing stories that portrayed doctors as careless or incompetent. She had specifically researched Dr. Martinez and found one negative review from a patient whose surgery had complications, which she used as evidence that he couldn't be trusted. Michael discovered that Rachel had been researching my financial situation online, looking up property values for my house, and searching for information about inheritance laws in Texas. She had also been visiting websites about end-of-life care and the costs of caring for aging parents. Most disturbing of all, Michael found text messages on Rachel's phone between her and her sister, discussing what would happen to the family finances when the old lady finally kicks the bucket. In one message, Rachel had written, "I just need her to refuse the surgery or have it go wrong. Either way, we'll finally be able to get the house we want." Armed with this evidence, Michael made the difficult decision to contact the police and report Rachel for attempted murder and child abuse. The investigation that followed revealed even more evidence of Rachel's planning and manipulation. It turned out that she had been researching heart conditions and cardiac surgery for months, learning about the risks of delaying treatment and the likelihood of fatal heart attacks in untreated patients. She had also been corresponding with a man named David, a divorced father of two who worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative. The relationship had started as an emotional affair, but had progressed to physical intimacy and plans for Rachel to leave Michael and move to another state with David. Rachel's plan, as reconstructed by investigators, was to prevent my surgery through fear and manipulation, wait for me to die of natural causes from my untreated heart condition, collect the inheritance money, divorce Michael, and start a new life with David using my money to fund their new beginning. The most chilling part of the investigation was the discovery that Rachel had already started transferring small amounts of money from Michael's accounts to a secret account she had opened under her maiden name, in preparation for her escape. Rachel was arrested and charged with attempted murder, fraud, and child endangerment. The trial was a media sensation in our small town, with the local newspaper running daily updates about the nurse who tried to kill her mother-in-law for inheritance money. During the trial, more details emerged about Rachel's character and history. It turned out that she had been fired from her previous nursing job for medication discrepancies, essentially stealing painkillers from patients. She had also been involved in financial disputes with her own family and had a pattern of manipulative behavior in relationships. The prosecution argued that Rachel was a sociopath who viewed people as obstacles to her desires, rather than as human beings deserving of love and respect. They showed that she had used her medical knowledge to plan what amounted to murder by medical neglect, and that she had psychologically abused a child to accomplish her goals. Rachel's defense attorney tried to argue that she had genuinely been concerned about my health, and that her warnings about surgical risks were motivated by medical expertise, rather than criminal intent. But the evidence of her financial planning, her affair, and her systematic manipulation of Jake was too overwhelming to overcome. Rachel was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison. She lost all custody rights to Jake, and Michael was granted a divorce with full custody of their son. My surgery was rescheduled and performed successfully by Dr. Martinez, who went out of his way to ensure that I received excellent care and made a full recovery. He told me later that in 15 years of practice, he had never encountered a case where a family member had attempted to sabotage a patient's care for financial gain. The recovery process was long and difficult, not just physically but emotionally. Jake required extensive therapy to undo the damage that Rachel had done to his understanding of trust, safety, and family relationships. For months, he was afraid that other people in his life, teachers, babysitters, even his father and me, might be secretly planning to hurt him or abandon him. Michael struggled with guilt and self-doubt, questioning how he could have been married to someone for 8 years without recognizing her true nature. He blamed himself for not protecting me and Jake from Rachel's manipulation, and he had difficulty trusting his own judgment in relationships.